I may have mentioned once before that since childhood I have been deeply fascinated by the Titanic. The shirt I'm wearing right now came from a Titanic exhibition that I attended in Birmingham. The cup I drink my coffee out of at home is in fact a replica Titanic third class mug. Right up there are some vintage White Star Line playing cards of the kind used on White Star Line ocean liners of the Titanic era, but not from the Titanic itself. However, if you want to see something that is from the Titanic itself, I have here a coal fragment that was recovered during the 1994 Titanic Research and Recovery Expedition, done by RMS Titanic Incorporated. So yeah, I'm a bit of a nut when it comes to this subject. So in spring of 2023, when the Titan sub disaster happened, I was pretty hooked. One of the few times I was avidly paying attention to the news and venturing into the depths of that online cesspool known as Reddit. I even did little videos on the events as they were happening at the time, well, at least until we got to day 4 and the inevitable conclusion of what had happened when the US Coast Guard announced that all hope for the 5 explorers was in fact lost. To be crass, the story kind of had everything. Titanic, yes. Human drama, yes. Deep ocean tech, yes. The forbidden horrors of the black abyss that no human under natural law should ever venture into, yes, yes, yes. Now, I was already a little bit familiar with OceanGate Company and the Titan Submersible previously. There's actually a comment on an old OceanGate promotional video of me expressing my awe at the Titan Submersible, me being super impressed with the huge viewing port and the fact that the submarine was a 5-person capacity instead of the regular 3 at those depths. Though, beyond that and some promotional materials, I never really looked too much into OceanGate, and quite rightly so. When the shit hit the fan, there was people reacting to my old comments, basically mocking my older naive admiration and idiocy. Well, this was before OceanGate themselves actually took down their channel, which has mercifully erased that indiscretion. I guess there's that. Not much longer after the confirmation of the loss of life, things started to quieten down a bit. A few things would surface over time. There was the footage of the wreckage itself being brought back to port by the Polar Prince. There was images of the wrecked submersible at its discovery 4 days into the search. And then there's the really fascinating testimonials a bit more recently of the US Coast Guard inquiry. Otherwise, there's kind of not much else that's been going on, so when my friend Darren Ferguson, UK Mets, told me about the Netflix Titan documentary, I felt like I really had to dive right into that. Despite the long intro, I am going to try and keep this review brief, partly to avoid spoilers, because honestly, I think you should go out and watch this. The documentary is mostly about the origins of the OceanGate Company, CEO Stockton Rush, and the Cyclops 2 submersible, which would eventually become the Titan. Honestly, if you were someone who was kind of interested and kept up to date with events and read the articles, there's not going to be too much new to this, though if you are among the uninitiated, it is a pretty good summary of the events and the troubled road to oblivion. There's some great interviews with former employees, experts, as well as some of the family of the deceased. There's some excellent footage I have never seen before. In fact, in the first minute of the documentary, there is a video clip taken from inside the Titan submersible on one of its last dives to the Titanic. When you can hear the popping and the cracking of the carbon fiber hull delaminating, it is pretty shocking to hear. And if I was scheduled to go down and I saw this, there's just no way in hell I would get on that thing. Speaking of scary submarine footage, during the US Coast Guard inquiries, there was some fantastic testimony from David Lockridge, formerly of OceanGate, who in fact was fired by Stockton Rush for raising so many safety concerns, and the fact that he wouldn't back down from them. If you ask me, he's probably the closest thing to a main protagonist in this entire travesty, though, to be honest, there were many insiders trying to do the right thing at OceanGate and who were ultimately discarded by the egomaniacal Stockton Rush. Anyway, during Lockridge's testimony that was released previously, he mentioned there was an incident that took place during a test of a submarine when they went to the wreck of the Andrea Doria. Stockton Rush was basically taking control of the piloting duties, and he got the submarine jammed right against the bow of the Andrea Doria itself, which could easily have been disastrous if Lockridge himself hadn't basically taken control, and Rush apparently had a bit of a tantrum about the whole thing. Well, that testimony did stir up a few things online, and people were very interested to hear it. And what's really cool is this documentary actually has some of the footage of that incident, which was just absolutely crazy to see. Of course, as I mentioned, David Lockridge was not the only one who fell afoul of Stockton Rush. The doc has many great interviews with people who were once enamored by the dream and the promise of OceanGate before the serious concerns really started to sink in. Particularly, we've got Lockridge, Emily Hammermeister, Tony Nissen, and Matt McCoy, who had a pretty shocking quote, he says, came directly from Stockton Rush, which was, if the Coast Guard started causing trouble, he would buy a congressman. That's like mob supervillain shit right there. That is just wow. In fact, there's just so much that came out after the disaster about the disgusting attitude towards safety from Rush and OceanGate. There seems to have just been a huge running aim throughout the years to cut costs whenever possible, and even the meagre token gestures of safety they put in place were just continuously ignored. Like I said earlier on, at the beginning of the documentary, you hear popping and cracking inside the hull of the submersible. Well, years earlier, they said they'd set up these acoustic sounders around the sub to record noises like that, and if there ever was any popping or cracking, it would basically be a red flag and a sign of danger, and something that would need to be addressed immediately. In the fact that we have multiple instances of video taken inside the sub where you hear popping and cracking, as well as many people's testimonies who went down on this sub and said the same thing, it just shows that even though they said this apparently was a red flag that needed a safeguard against, they just ignored it. They just kept ignoring their own warning signs, and there's that. There was the 3-strike rule, where they said if 3 things went wrong in a dive, they'd have to abort, when, you know, only one thing has to go fucking wrong on a dive, and everyone is dead, and we can probably surmise that's actually what did eventually happen. Just, there was a failure somewhere, and then boom, basically. There was also footage in the documentary of them pressure testing the hull. They performed this on a scaled down model of the submersible. Now, the successful hull that they did create first time, they reckon it was rated to a maximum depth of about 4,100 meters before it would implode. And considering that the Titanic itself is at a depth of around 3,800 meters, that is a 300-meter margin of error, which I would not be fucking comfortable with when it came to people's safety. It's also quite eerie how much the destroyed test model of the submarine kind of resembles what they found of the actual remains of the real submersible on the ocean floor. Even in the footage of the successful Titanic dives, in my opinion, there's just some really scary things in there. I'm just a layman, but it seems that on these dives they were just getting way too close to the wreck. I don't think it was stated in this documentary, but I do know Titan's huge viewing port was actually designed so it would reduce the kind of magnification effect that you typically get on deep ocean submersibles. And the fact that through this giant viewing port with much less magnification, they seem so close to the Titanic, it is just very, very unnerving and uncomfortable to watch, quite frankly. There's just so many concerning instances like this and stories which I can't really go over without spoiling things too much in the documentary, and I do think people should watch this. The archive footage is just really interesting, and the interviews provide another added dimension to things. There's a particular interview that I want to note where towards the end, someone is introduced as the influencer. Now, my eyes kind of rolled in the back of my head with this because I personally hate that term, and I hate it when people use that term to describe themselves. So as far as I'm aware, this fellow didn't do that. In fact, this guy is someone called Jake, who has a very successful YouTube channel, which I am now subscribed to, by the way. His brief recounting of events is actually quite moving and really shows the perspective of someone who like has come to the realization that they could easily have become one of the lost if things had just went a little bit differently. There's just so much that ultimately went on at OceanGate that you can't help but feel that was just always going to end this way. The only thing I feel the documentary is maybe lacking is it doesn't really cover much of the fatal dive itself and what happened in it. It's focused very much on the build-up and some of the later testimonies about the event and, you know, what could have potentially caused it. To be fair to the documentary, though, it does state that as of making of the documentary, in fact, as of making my own video right now, the Coast Guard has yet to release any of its findings or any conclusions to its investigation, so I guess there isn't really much of a bookend to things anyway. Since I never really did much of a conclusion to my previous Titan vid, I may as well wrap up some of my final thoughts here, especially since we are still waiting for that Coast Guard report. I can't help but feel this entire OceanGate saga was just this tragic comedy of errors, or at least it would have been funny if innocent people were not killed in it, and I am not counting Stockton Rush as one of the innocents, of course. It may be quite bad taste to speak ill of the dead, especially someone who can't defend themselves, but I feel I can say with a good degree of certainty that he is responsible for everything that had happened. Not just him being the CEO, who the book ultimately stops with. Just about every bad decision that happened when it came to like design of the sub, safety, policies, and the just implementation of like procedure. All those bad decisions seem to have come like pretty much directly from his influence. There's still yet to be any major charges made against anyone involved in OceanGate for the disaster, but the truth is the man who is ultimately responsible for this and who should be facing criminal charges is amongst those who perished at the bottom of the North Atlantic when his little vanity project imploded in spring of 2023. Deep sea submersible diving has kind of always been dangerous. In fact, part of the reason remotely operated unmanned vehicles were developed is because of this danger, and interestingly the development of that technology is quite massively linked to the history of Titanic exploration. But even said, with the great risks to human life from deep sea diving, we had a nearly 37-year streak of successful and safe exploration of the Titanic wreck at the hands of professionals. At least we did have a safe streak until spring 2023. Well, that's a bit of a downer ending to this review, but I absolutely do recommend everyone goes out there, and if you've got Netflix, to watch the Titan documentary. It is like really fascinating. It's a good summary of everything that had happened. I myself, I just want to thank everyone who has watched this video, and hope you all stay safe and take care out there, and you all have a good one.